with 3D, with AI, they're just tools. And the real differentiator is your taste and how you use it and whether you actually have something to say.
Well, welcome back to the Church Circle podcast, the podcast that celebrates church creatives. And this is episode 6 of season 1. And we've had a lot of cool guests so far, but the guest I'm really excited about today is Josh Warner, all the way from Redding, California. So a little bit of background. I have been following Josh for a long time. And I remember when I was working for a church in like 2018, this font came out called NF Ultra. And I used that font all year. That was like our church font for the year. And years later, maybe it was like 2 or 3 years later, I found out the creator of that was in fact Josh Warner. And so now it's just, it's very good to have the creator of such cool things on the podcast. So thanks for joining us. But how are you doing?
I'm doing really well. Yeah, coming to you live from my daughter's bedroom. So I figured I'd put some of her art up on the walls just because it's actually better than mine.
It runs in the family.
Yeah.
Well, we were talking earlier, and this podcast really is about highlighting both creative seen and unseen. And for some of you, you would have seen Josh's work, but you may not necessarily know who Josh is. And I think Josh's character is at the same level, if not better, than the work. We want to kind of dive into that a little bit and kind of get to know him, get to know the guy behind the work. And so, yeah, Josh, maybe you just want to tell us kind of who you are and a bit about your story.
Yeah. So I live here in Redding, California. We moved here in 2018. Before that, I guess to make a long story short, I started making posters for my friends' bands when I was a kid, and then kept that going for a little while, even though I have no musical talent whatsoever. And kept that going, and then kind of left it a little bit to go into mission. So I joined YWAM in 2008, Youth of the Mission. And then while there, I was in San Francisco, met my wife there, ended up going to Las Vegas and serving with Youth of the Mission there. And then that's when I really started figuring out, like, okay, I know how to use Photoshop a little bit. We need some postcards, we need some posters to advertise for different things like schools or events or anything like that. So I started doing that. And then we had a Flash website from like 1999 or something, where it was like 800 by 600 and it had like a splash intro video with like the 2-point pixel font on there. And so I was like, I think we could probably do something better than this. So I taught myself how to build websites and kind of went from there. And then we ended up moving to Florida to step out of YWAM, and that's when I was like, okay, I need to find some kind of job. So I was like, maybe I can make design a career, or at least see how it goes. So I started with an internship, and then one thing led to another. Started working with one agency, then another, and then got connected with Bethel. We ended up moving out here to Redding, and it's kind of gone from there.
So just YWAM to graphic designer. So it's been cool. I've kind of been following your journey, like I said, for a few years, and you're still evolving your style and your design, and even the mediums in which you're creating. So you talked about kind of posters and stuff, and I don't want to get too ahead of ourselves, but I think we should just dive in and then we can kind of go from there. But let's say 3 years ago, you were like Photoshop and Illustrator, that kind of thing, and now I've noticed you started doing more 3D work. So what's the kind of deal with the 3D? What kind of software are you using, and why have you kind of made the switch?
Yeah, a couple of years back, while I was at Bethel Music, I was working with a guy named Dario, who's still a designer, art director there, still working there, and he started getting into Blender, and I was like, I've kind of been wanting to check it out a little bit. I downloaded it and tested it on my 2012 MacBook, and it just like bricked the computer. So, but it was like interesting. And the more he got into it, the more I was interested as well. And so during that time, I had been getting a lot more into making type. And so I released like NF Ultra and a few other ones. And as I was making that, I was like, I'm getting a little bit burned out on making fonts. I still love custom type and doing that for a project, but it can take months to make a font. And I just didn't have the endurance to do that. So I had kind of earlier in my career, kind of like, okay, well, design is all about just combining type and image. So maybe for a while I could focus on type and get good at that. But after a while, I was still just like finding Unsplash pictures, just digging out whatever I could to put the type over. And it's like, I need to start making images on my own, but I'm not a good photographer. So how can I get into that? And that was when I started really searching out 3D. And I think part of it too is finding the kind of stuff that I like to do, or that I'm interested in, the kind of looks that I want to achieve, because a lot of 3D is really technically great, but artistically kind of mid, I guess. And that goes for a lot of things as well. But it was like, once I could see that it was possible to create something like really beautiful and interesting, then it was like, okay, this is what I want to do. And so that's when I started really getting into it. Did a couple of projects and it went well. So it was like, then I could justify building my own PC that could actually run Cinema 4D and Redshift, which is what I use now. And from there, it just kind of kept going. Really, it's like, I love design. I still love doing it. I love working with other people's images and video. And I want to keep doing that for the future as well. But being able to create kind of whatever you want and achieve any look that might just pop into your head is really, it can be kind of scary at sometimes and overwhelming. But I like that challenge, because I'm always just like looking at Pinterest and trying to figure out like what's missing, like what I don't see here, or what different direction I could take something in. I love seeing other people's work, but I'm always like, what kind of unique perspective could I bring here?
Mm-hmm. That's in a very unique way that people you look at Pinterest compared to other people. Like when I go on Pinterest, I'm like, what other person's work can inspire my design, right? Like what can I, and you're like, how can I just inspire other people? Which is really cool. But I mean, if you guys haven't seen Josh's work, I'm like on his Instagram while we're on this podcast right now. Just go to joshwarner.art at his, or just type in Josh Warner, he'll come up on Instagram, and just scroll through like the grid, and you will see a level of detail that I don't think many other designers even want to go near. Like when you talk about this whole, like you said about it being scary, like being in this blank canvas and you can control every aspect. Like as a designer, I like to problem solve, and what tends to happen is when you problem solve, you have some things to work with and you move them around and you try and fit them in the right place that makes the most sense. But when it comes to 3D, the problem that needs solving is so much bigger, because you basically have unlimited possibilities. So how do you refine that? How do you not make that scary, if that makes sense?
I mean, just like anybody, I'm a little afraid of a blank canvas. Even in Illustrator, my go-to move in Illustrator is just like throw 20 different fonts down on the page, just so at least there's something there. Kind of like as writers, it's like you just gotta write whatever's in your head, even if it's just like random gibberish, just so you have something down on the page, and then you can go from there. So one of the easy things you can do in 3D is just like you have base setup scenes. Like I have like a still life kind of setup with like a long focal length lens and like 3-point lighting system and a backdrop, that kind of thing. But yeah, a lot of the time I'll just kind of get rid of everything and start from scratch. And, if I found like a nice model, like I throw gold on everything. So it's just like, I found a nice like statue of the Virgin Mary or something. Let's just put that in the scene, throw some gold on it. And then we'll start putting in lights. You start with the absolute most basic thing. Just start with one light, and it's like you start building from there.
So how are you? And this, I didn't expect us to go into this level of detail, but I'm finding this super interesting. So you've got a studio set up. So it's almost like you're walking into a physical studio. You have your models that you put in place, and you're going to light them. But how do you now think about so let's say you're doing an album cover and you've done some really cool album covers, or let's say you're doing a poster or something, right? You've got this intersection of the 3D and the type and the information that needs to be on there. When you're creating in you said it was Redshift, right?
Yeah, Cinema 4D is
Cinema
the
4D
3D program, then Redshift the renderer. Yeah.
Okay. So this is how much I know. We're all learning together.
No worries.
So when you're creating it in Cinema 4D, and is it Cinema 4D or is it Blender? Did I say the wrong one?
Cinema 4D, yeah.
Cinema 4D. Okay, sorry everyone. I'm learning as we go. When you're creating in Cinema, are you thinking about the text and where it's going to go, or are you just kind of like, oh, I'll work that out like later? How does that even work?
I think from the very beginning, I'm thinking composition. It's like especially for an album cover, it's like obviously it's always going to be square. And then I'll build out like social assets and stuff like that for different dimensions later. But honestly, for the most part, I am kind of always working in the back of my head. So for a lot of these things, I've had a lot of ideas just like germinating back there. It's like a lot of things just they aren't appropriate for one project or another, but then something comes up where it's like, oh, okay, I think this could be a good use case for this. So for example, there's a project with a really great group out of Texas called Bristol House. And they had this album called Altars that they were working on. And they sent over this mood board that was really, really cool, really moody and evocative. And they are Methodists. So without getting too hot takey, they're less uncomfortable with like the symbolism of the church's history than other, I think, like more mainstream, like non-denominational churches who kind of like want to distance themselves from that. And so it gave us a lot of room to use like heavy symbolism. I actually have like an altar and candles and statues and crucifixes and stuff. So that at least gives you something to work with. And then it kind of evolves from there where it's like I had kind of wanted to do just an all gold cover for a while. And so it actually wasn't the main thing that I pitched, but it was another option where it was like, it just covered everything in gold. Let's see how they like that. Maybe it could be like a deluxe version or something for a vinyl. And then they ended up going with that. But to answer your question, it's so much of it is just like composition, and it's just like you get your elements on the canvas and then you're just kind of rearranging and seeing what sticks. There's a lot of kind of tried and true things. It's like you can use the rule of thirds. You can set up your grids in different ways. You can emphasize things in the center, or you can be really asymmetrical with it. And I'm not necessarily like thinking about, yes, I'm going to use the rule of thirds in this situation, but you just kind of feel it over time. And you kind of gravitate towards that. Because I think, honestly, experience over time helps you come up with working solutions a lot faster. Like that's the big differentiator, I think. It's like you kind of know what's going to work and what's not going to work. And you don't have to necessarily like do all of the things that don't work first before you can get to what does work.
Yeah. So
it was kind of a rambling answer. But
no, it's good. It's good. I find it fascinating because this is, when I'm talking to designers, I would say you're an artist that designs as opposed to a designer that does art, right? So like,
yeah.
when I'm talking to designers, I'm kind of in the same sphere as them, but this is one of those spheres that is we kind of overlap, but we don't. So even just things like how long does it take you? Like how long would it take to do? Let's say we're looking at the Altars album, right? By Bristol House, which if you guys haven't seen that, go and look at it. It's insane. I mean, I'm on Instagram again. I'm looking. You did like 3 different options, and all of them are insane. But like, how long does something like that take? Even to just like let's just say from start to the first draft. Like, how long does that take?
I mean, the annoying answer is that it depends. Obviously, depending on what you're working with. But something like that took several days of like actually working on it. And then, like I said, I'm kind of just always thinking about it. So like even at night, before I go to bed, I'm like, okay, well, maybe I could try something like this tomorrow. I read this one, it's not a quote, or I don't think it's a direct quote, but Ernest Hemingway would always, when he was writing, he would always leave off in the middle of a sentence. And which I feel like would drive me crazy, but it was the idea that you want to come back to work with something to start with, an idea that you need to either finish or like to go from. And so I think that's kind of where I'm at basically all the time. I just have a ton of ideas that I want to try, and they're kind of waiting for the right project to try them on. So yeah, that one was several days of like, 8-hour shifts working on it, broken up into a few weeks. And then it had revisions. Like Bristol House, the client, they had great suggestions. They were super fun to work with. They suggested adding more candles to it, which was great. And then in the teaser graphics, which we made kind of after the fact, or not the teaser graphics, the single graphics, those were kind of the idea of like an altar in progress. And so they were like, what about like a goblet or something that we could use for that? Like the grail essentially. And so we put that in there and it was like, yeah, this works really well.
Yeah, I didn't even know they were connected. I'm looking at them now, and yeah, it's so cool. But and that's the thing.
Yeah,
the gold carries through, and now you've mentioned that, I'm seeing how it carries through. But they're pieces of art in their own way, right? Like each one is not just this is the same color palette, same fonts, whatever. It's like these are all their own individually handcrafted things. And they would hold up as their own album cover, not just a single cover on their own. And yet you're producing this kind of stuff for one album launch, which is crazy.
Mm-hmm. And that's honestly kind of the magic of 3D. It's using a lot of these same elements and rearranging them and finding some other symbolism or some other message that you want to say.
Hey, just pausing our chat with Josh here for a quick second to invite you over to our Church Circle community. Church Circle launched last week and it's thriving, and I really want you to be part of it. If you've ever felt unheard in all the social media groups you've been part of, not getting the answers or support you need, then Church Circle is the place for you. It's an active community where church staff, pastors, and creatives like you come together to share insights, offer guidance, and genuinely support each other. I got tired of posting in those huge, inactive Facebook groups and hearing crickets. So I joined Church Circle. People's questions don't just get answered, they spark conversations. I really believe we're building something special here. A place where you're not just another pixel on a screen, but a person with a story, with a place in our community. Click the link in the episode's description to see what a real, engaged online community looks like. You can be part of 27 Facebook groups, or you can be part of one Church Circle. Trust me, it's a world of difference. Can't wait to see you there. With the church in 3D, this is a very kind of new scape. Like this, obviously Bristol House is a worship collective, and there's now feels like there's starting to be some acceptance of 3D in the church space. What do you think the relationship looks like between church and 3D moving forward? Like, is it something that's going to be like the new design? Is it going to be the new like Unsplash, like people just making stuff on their own instead of having to go and find stock photos and stock images? Or is it going to be reserved for the more artsy stuff? Like, I can just imagine a world where sermon series are no longer just, like you said, Unsplash photos with text, but like we're doing a story on Job, and you can create all of these things and all this imagery, and you can make it exactly how you want it for the right composition with the right screen size, all of that kind of stuff. So, yeah, I mean, what are your thoughts? I'm interested to know the experts' thoughts on church in 3D.
I guess I kind of see it. It's just another tool, really, and it's becoming so much more accessible. Like if anyone wanted to get into it, I would recommend everyone does. Though it took me several years of trying and failing before I got my head around just like working in a 3D space and setting up a scene and figuring out lighting and rendering, even just using the tool itself. But to me, it's just like a tool. Like, a lot of people are afraid of AI, like Midjourney and Stable Diffusion and stuff like that coming out. And I guess I see it as well as just kind of, it's another tool to use. Like you can still identify the good stuff from the bad. And generally, I haven't seen anything. I've used Midjourney a lot, and I haven't seen anything coming out of there that really moved me, honestly. There was one album cover by a rap artist. I don't actually remember who it was, but they specifically used Midjourney or Stable Diffusion to make a cover, and it was really intentionally well done because the faces were all distorted. And so that was like an interesting use case for it. But with 3D, with AI, all of these things, they're just tools, and there's a lot of like ethical stuff that goes into AI, whatever. But if you're using it, again, they're just tools. And the real differentiator is your taste and how you use it and whether you actually have something to say. I think I rebound a lot or recoil a lot, I guess, from things being a little bit too on the nose, especially in the church world. It's like we have to be, there can be zero ambiguity about what you are trying to communicate here, which is why people gravitate a lot towards. It's like you find a verse, you find a psalm, you find an unsplash picture, you find a nice font in Creative Market, and then you throw a black market texture over the top, and that's it. And it looks really nice. It's great. But it's really easy to scroll past that, and it's not really challenging you to think a little bit more deeply about things. Which again, like, no hate on anyone doing that. I think that's a great way to start out, but I'd also encourage anyone, if that's your thing, like maybe just go look around and see what other kind of stuff you could do that maybe doesn't have any text at all, and try to communicate the same thing. Or maybe you're collaging pictures in a different way that brings out your own unique perspective on that verse or whatever kind of theme that you're trying to say. So yeah, all that to say, 3D, Midjourney, AI stuff. Really, it all comes back to what is your level of taste, and do you actually have something meaningful to say, and can you execute in saying that?
It's interesting you say that, because I'm reminded of we've almost done a full circle with new mediums, of the sense that the church, apart from, let's say, 300 years ago, before that, a lot of it was imagery. It was iconography, and it was stained glass windows, and it was things like physical things to represent biblical stories or to represent God's word. And the reason was because people couldn't read. So there needed to be a visual representation. And so by choice back then, it meant that things had to be illustrated in a visual way, and that couldn't just be communicated. So it feels like we're almost doing there's a lot of conversation about being in the biggest communication shift of the last 500 years. Now we've moved to social, but as you say, there's so much noise now. Maybe one of the strategies and tactics is to kind of go back to what we knew worked 500 years ago, and just new ways of doing it. So like all of your stuff that you produce, whether it's intentional or not, it feels like there's history behind it, right? Like there's symbolism, and there's imagery that we associate with the medieval church or the early church. And it's called, I think that's maybe I'm verbally processing what I really appreciate about your work, but now I'm kind of seeing it in a new light. And so you're almost like a medieval craftsman who's been given a laptop. And I think it's really cool.
That. I'll take that.
You can put that in your bio if you want on Instagram.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, it's funny because that's really come about from, I really tried hard to not have a particular style, and then out of that has come a particular style. Like, I mean, you look at my grid or whatever, and it's like, this guy has a look that he does. Which sometimes I'm like, how do I do something really different? And like maybe use some colors besides black and white and gold. But yeah, honestly, like a huge influence for me is just like Baroque, Renaissance, medieval art. Because to me, there was a lot of bad stuff going on in the church at the point. But in terms of art, visual arts, that was really the high point. And honestly, I feel like right now we're actually at like the next great peak of that. Like there's more talent in the church right now than at any other point in history, even like compared to like Michelangelo, Raphael, those guys back in those days. Like they had the greats, the heavy hitters working for the Pope, but we have just like thousands of people. Like Pro Church Media now has like 200,000 followers, more than that. And like, even to say 100, half of that are actual like working creatives in the church. That's still 100,000 people. That's a lot of really good talent. And like tools are more accessible than they've ever been before. Inspiration is more accessible. Education is more accessible than it's ever been before. And so I think honestly, like the floor of creative in the church has really been raised. Like the average has really gone up a lot. And so I think for me, then it's kind of going back to how do we push the ceiling of that, and like not just do good work or like work that that does its job and serves the purpose without hurting what we're trying to do? And how do we make like great work, like amazing work? And I think that's kind of my dream, I guess, or like personal goal. It's like I want work. People go see the Sistine Chapel from all over the world. It's like a massive tourist attraction. Like, I don't want to make the Sistine Chapel, not Michelangelo, but I do want to make work that anyone could see and they would go, this is really powerful and evocative. And even though I might have been like hurt by the church, I can still see that this came from a place of like real, I don't know, desire to tell a story and to make something meaningful and beautiful out of a place of worship. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. That's really cool. It's kind of like, we are such a throwaway society now where we're just like Instagram is such a, if it's not today, it's done. If it's not in the last few hours, it's done. But when people back then created stuff, it was for generations. Like, it would take generations to build the church in the first place. Like in the UK, at least, the average like sort of time, and I'm kind of making this up, but from my kind of understanding of history, is it would take 50, 60, 70, 100 plus years to just build a church. And that requires people, more than one person, to spend their entire life or spend a long period of time dedicated to one project. And as a throwaway society where each day we've got to do something new, you're kind of talking about this whole idea of, well, what is like the thing, what is the legacy of what I'm creating, and like how much meaning does it have? And I think the longer we spend on something, the longer it lasts, if that makes sense. Like, there's more beauty and therefore it stands the test of time. So yeah, there is a real tension there. But it's, I think, and we talked about this kind of in the pre-show, which doesn't exist, but we were kind of chatting to each other about getting work out there, because obviously if you're freelance or if you're wanting to inspire people in general, you want to get your work out in a consistent way. And we're battling with the algorithms, we're battling with all of this noise that we're trying to stay above. How do you balance working on, without burning out? How do you balance creating stuff, sharing stuff, kind of getting stuff out there, but also taking your time to craft it? Like, there's such a tension that I don't even know how you do that. So any thoughts?
Man, I struggle with that constantly. I think a lot of these things, I don't know if you ever figure it out. Like, some people are just like really, really good, and they have their niche, and they are good at hitting that over and over and over again, and making reels about it and posting every day and that kind of thing. You can build your personal brand as an artist. And I just always felt really uncomfortable with that. Not from any kind of just like moral or ethical or anything like that. Just like, I find the word content just like really gross. I just find it so incredibly demeaning to what we do. Not that I'm precious with the stuff that I do or that we make. It's I feel grateful and honored that I get to do it, but it's so difficult for me to just make something just to post, and it doesn't really mean anything. Sometimes I'll go on I'll get inspired and I'll make a few things and I'll be able to post those. But even still, in the back of my mind, I'm like, is this gonna do okay on Instagram? Like, I need to turn this into a reel, because reels are it right now. And that's just like, oh man. But a lot of the stuff, you're just always going to kind of deal with. Like, people talk about imposter syndrome, and I'm like, dude, I suffer from that still, like, but at the same time, if I didn't have imposter syndrome, I probably wouldn't be as good as I am now, because it's what's driven me to constantly like to try to get better and to try to learn new things and to try to grow. I think if you lose that, honestly, that's when you start to stagnate. I haven't figured it out. It's like we were talking about, there's gems and there's hidden gems. It's like, how do I not be a hidden gem?
We almost need to create a social platform that it's almost like the amount of time you spend, and you can log the amount of time is the amount of reach you can get. And there's and so that when the person posts once a year, because they spent a whole year making something, they could at least get the most amount of reach they could get for the time they spent. But no one would would like that idea because they wouldn't see content enough. But yeah, I know what you mean. I think the one kind of thing I'm getting out of this conversation is to value not just what you're creating, but the meaning behind it, and to almost focus more on, especially when you're getting started on a project, of what is the meaning of this project and what am I trying to convey to the viewer. And it's almost like when you create, you're saying, in the least amount of words and in the least amount of noise, how can I communicate a story or an image or a meaning? And then you're creating from a blank canvas, basically, that. So it's like it's fully stripped back, but it's the most pure form of art. It just communicates and is open to slight interpretation, but it has a meaning. So I think if you're listening and you're a designer, I think this is challenging for designers, particularly because they're so focused on problem solving that sometimes they have to step away and just focus on the actual visual. Maybe just think a little bit when you're brainstorming, think about the meaning of stuff and what you're creating. What's the meaning and the purpose behind it? And maybe that means you don't make 5 graphics per week, you make 3, depending obviously on what these graphics are for or whatever. But maybe the 3 will do much better on Instagram, or maybe they'll mean something more to the congregation than the 5 because there was meaning and depth behind it. Would you say that's an accurate kind of summary of your thoughts, or would you have more?
Yeah, I would. It's funny though, because it's like I was immediately thinking of like on the other hand, but I would say yes, absolutely, 100%. But also to get to the point where you are making work that you're proud of, you probably need to just do a ton of work. So if you're at an early stage in your career, I think my main advice would be just make as much work as you possibly can, and you might as well post it up on Instagram, to start building your following your brand or whatever. But as you're doing that and you're refining your style or you're refining your techniques and your tools, building your tool belt, really start thinking about what is missing or what you as a person or a creative have to say, or what your perspective on this psalm that everybody's posted. It's like, you want to do Jeremiah 29:11, that's great. Let's find some way that nobody else has created for that. It's like, find a different perspective on that that's unique to you, using the tools that you have developed by just doing a ton of work.
Yeah. So work hard and think hard and try to find a way to not burn out.
Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah. You got to find a way to make it interesting to yourself, or else, you are just going to burn out. And then, so many people, so many creative, like really talented creatives, leave the church because I feel like, from what I've seen, not just because they worked too hard, but because they worked super hard and didn't really believe in the stuff that they were making. Not like they didn't believe in God, more like they just weren't excited about what they were making because it was just content. There wasn't any meaning behind it. It was just to make some more noise.
It sounds like passion is the glue that holds it all together, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah,
like
I would say so.
If you're going to work hard and if you're going to think hard about the stuff you're creating, and if you're not passionate, that's where you're more likely to see burnout. But if you are passionate, you can kind of keep it together because you know what you're doing it for.
Yeah, I would say passion, but that can only take you so far too. I think just having like rhythms of creativity and just kind of showing up. Like, I'm a huge routine guy. I just like to show up at 8:30 and I get started working. I got my coffee and I'll make stuff until I feel inspired, and then I'll make more stuff. But I think, work hard and I guess think more deeply. Like, there's so much to the craft of just like making and creating that is outside of the tools. It's so much more about, like, to go from a beginning designer to a good designer, you have to learn the tools, obviously. To go from a good designer to a great designer, you have to learn how to think. And that is by far the much more difficult thing. And that takes a lot of like reading, just like really studying great work, what works about it, and like composition and layout and type especially. But all of that just really takes like thinking deeply and marinating on what really makes good work rather than just like, this is cool. It's like, it's more about like, is this effective or is this meaningful in a way, or powerful?
It kind of reminds me of when like God asks Solomon, he's like, what do you want? And he's like, I just want to be wise. And it's like God gives him everything because he asked for wisdom to help his people. And it's kind of that, it's almost the same thing of like when we, and maybe this is kind of going off on a tangent. I mean, we're already over, but I think this is such a good conversation. We can keep going for a few more minutes. But when you kind of introduce God into this kind of equation we're talking about, and you just ask God to help you think, I think that's where the increase comes from, because we can, like you said, we can only do so much from passion. We can only do so much on our own in terms of learning skills and the tools. And then to get us to the next level, like we almost need that, well, we do need that divine inspiration, that divine. And I think we were talking in the pre-show as well about how there's all these creatives in the church, and it's never been a stronger time for the church creatively. And I think that's because there's people genuinely pursuing God and the heart of God, and then through that, God's blessing their creativity. So don't know where that was going, but it's just an interesting thought of like, when we reach our capacity of thoughts, God has so much more ahead of that. And even if he imparted 0.00001% of that, we would be the most inspired creative on the planet. So maybe the message is from me anyway. If you feel like you're at an end with your thought process, your creative block, whatever it might be, have you tried accessing the supernatural as opposed to just what your physical limitations are? But yeah, I love that. That's challenged me as well. Mr. Unsplash and fonts. I'm like, where do I go now?
Dude, I use Unsplash all the time. I love creative market.
Well, I would love to keep chatting, and I feel like we could keep going for another hour, and maybe in the future we'll come back again. But have you got any final thoughts, Josh? Some bits of wisdom that you just want to share, or even just maybe how we can kind of find out more about you and keep following your journey?
Yeah, absolutely. If anybody has any questions, I'm always open. My Instagram is at joshwarner.art. And my website is joshwarner.design. But I'm super passionate about art in the church, and I love talking to people about it. So yeah, if you guys have any questions or anything like that, like definitely reach out.
Please do. Because I remember messaging Josh in like 2020 when I first got started, and he helped me and we got chatting, and yeah, it's been a friendship since. So thank you so much, Josh. Really appreciate your time. Thank you for imparting your wisdom and just giving all of that experience and sharing it with us. So I really appreciate it. And join us next time for the Church Circle podcast. If you want to know more, if you want to be part of the Church Circle community as well, you can head over to prochurchmedia.com to find out more. And feel free to give us a rating on Apple or Spotify podcasts. It helps expand our reach, and more people can find out about people like Josh who are doing incredible things in the church community. So thank you so much, Josh, and we'll see you guys next time.